Go ahead and get started. Thank you again and welcome everyone to today's live Zoom event. My name is Jeannie Sager and I am the director of the Women's Philanthropy Institute. And here at WPI, we conduct, curate, and disseminate research that grows women's philanthropy. And I want to thank you all again for taking time out of your day to join us in commemorating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This culmination of a decades-long march to the women's right to vote was led by suffragists, a disparate group spread across geography, race, and cultures. How did these women come together to advance a single cause without networking tools like Facebook and email? And lacking official political power, how did women use philanthropy to advance their cause? And moreover, how did the movement respond to questions around intersectionality and race, challenges that we continue to grapple with today? So we are so excited to have Joan Marie Johnson, author of Funding Feminism, Monied Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, 1870 to 1967, to share more about the fascinating history of the women behind the 19th Amendment, and to bring the conversation forward 100 years later, where women are still coming together to advance movements for gender equality, climate change, social justice, and more. Joan has been a long-standing friend of WPI, a historian and author. She is the author of numerous books and articles on American women history, race, social reform, education, and philanthropy. And in her most recent book, Funding Feminism, Monied Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement from 1870 to 1967, shows how wealthy women wielded their money to help make change for women, including winning the right to vote, access to higher education, birth control, and better conditions for working women. She is also the author of Southern Women at the Seven Sisters Colleges, Feminist Values and Social Activism from 1875 to 1915, and Southern Ladies, New Women, Race, Region, and Club Women in South Carolina from 1898 to 1930. She's also co-edited a 3-volume historical anthology on South Carolina women, Their Lives and Times. Dr. Johnson received her PhD from UCLA in Women's and Southern History and taught history at Northeastern Illinois University for 12 years. She was the co-founder and co-director of the Newberry Seminar on Women and Gender at the Newberry Library in Chicago, and now works in the office of the provost at Northwestern University. Joan lives in Evanston, Illinois with her husband and 3 children, and we are just absolutely thrilled to have you here today, Dr. Johnson. So I'm going to pass the baton to you and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm just thrilled to be here. I'm a huge fan of the Women's Philanthropy Institute. Your research has really informed my research, so I'm very happy to be here. Thank you to Jeannie and to Tessa and Ellen for helping to set everything up as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can see some great illustrations that I have from the women of 100 years ago. But before we do that, I did want to start with a little bit of a poll to see this week, how many times have you written an email, posted on Facebook, and tweeted? So we have a few options here for you, less than 20, somewhere between 20 and 100. 100 to 500 or 500 or more. And I hope everyone will fill it out and submit. I'm going to submit my own. And we'll get the results in just a minute. I'm starting off asking these questions because I'm here to answer the question, how did suffragists build community when they didn't have social media and they didn't have the internet? And as Jeannie said in the introduction, they were a disparate group. All across the country, from the Northeast to the Southwest, Southeast, everywhere, rural towns, big cities, There were white women, Black women, Native American women, Asian American women, Latinas. So really a wide group of women, including lawyers, journalists, working women, and some wealthy donors as well. So how did they connect and build community across such a disparate space and across cultural divides? Well, it looks like many of you are writing and posting and tweeting quite a bit in the 100 up to 100 and 100 to 500, and we've even got a few of you who are doing 500 or more. You are very similar to women in the suffrage movement who were communicating in a similar way by putting pen to paper. So this is a letter from Susan B. Anthony to Jane Stanford in 1895. Jane Stanford was the founder, along with her husband, of Stanford University. Suffragists spent hours a day writing thousands of letters, and luckily for us as historians, they saved them. So we're reading just thousands and thousands of these letters, which have been preserved in archives around the country. Luckily for me, in the early 20th century, they did discover the typewriter, so that helps quite a bit. But as you can see, they were very, very busy, just as we are now using the internet. This is Frances Willard's desk. She was a temperance leader and very important suffragist here in Evanston, Illinois. You can see how busy she was, the mounds of paper piled up while she's sitting at her desk. And she had a secretary, Anna Gordon, who was a little bit more organized. You can see all her filing cabinets for her correspondence. This is Mary McLeod Bethune. She started a school for girls in Daytona, Florida, as well as later worked in FDR's administration, and she was a suffragist. And you can see by the big pile of paper on her desk how busy she was as well. So these were women who were writing to each other and to members of their organizations. So a lot of what we're reading when we're reading their letters are their business letters. They're raising money, they're planning meetings, they're planning conferences, they're exchanging ideas, strategies, tactics about how to win voters to their side to vote for the right to vote for women. They also, at times, wrote some malicious letters that we once in a while discover in the archives as well. So this is one where M. Carrie Thomas and Edith Hooker, two suffragists, were complaining about Alice Blackwell's letter. Alice Blackwell was upset with the board at the National Organization for Suffrage because she didn't think they were supporting her newspaper, the Woman's Journal. And Thomas and Hooker were upset because Blackwell even sent her letter of complaint to Norway. So we can see also kind of the machinations behind what was happening in the movement, who the characters were, what the different organizations were, how their tactics were working out with each other, and the wide reach of these letters going all the way to Norway, as Thomas noted. We can also see the very deep friendships that were part of this movement as well, and really important because they're what sustained these suffragists as they were going through similar kinds of challenges. So on the left is Marion Bernie Wilkinson, who was a leader of the South Carolina Federation of Women's Clubs, and her dear friend Charlotte Hawkins Brown, who was also a school founder in North Carolina, a club woman, and together they were in many, many different Black women's organizations, very important suffragists. And this is just a little clip from a letter that Marion wrote to Charlotte. This is after the death of Marion's husband, and you can see that she's talking to her about being close like a sister and always welcoming Charlotte into her home. that she always has a place there. So I think another thing that we see in some of these letters is the importance of these deep relationships among the suffragists, the ways that they did share their experiences and sometimes depended on these letters to build the kinds of relationships so that they could have them across state lines or across the nation as well, and really build these networks, national networks of suffragists. We can also see from the letters the importance of lesbian relationships in the movement. So here are two of the leaders, presidents of the national organization, Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Cat, with their partners, as well as Lucy Diggs Slowe, who was a dean at Howard University, and her partner. And I think we're really just beginning as historians to scratch the surface in understanding the importance and role of queer women in the movement, and the ways in which their ideas and challenges to gender norms at the time were really important as well. So they were primarily writing letters to each other, building community among themselves as suffragists. They also, especially when they needed to reach a wider audience, wrote newspapers. So there's lots of different newspapers that these women wrote to reach each other, again, internal organizational newspapers, but also, and really importantly, to reach the wider public. And so here we see Catherine McCormick and Maude Park out in the streets, and I'll talk a little bit more about the importance of them being out in the streets later on, selling the Women's Journal, getting their word out to the public through their newspapers. And I'll show you a few of these newspapers. This is The Revolution, which was started in the 1860s by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And Susan B. Anthony was one of these early proponents of really ensuring that women had their own voice and were able to express their own opinions about important topics to them at the time that just wouldn't be covered in the other local newspapers. Susan B. Anthony said it was so that women could, quote unquote, sauce back their opponents. So it was really important that they could control their own voice. This is Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, a Black club woman and suffragist from Boston. And she started one of the early Black women's clubs, the Woman's Era, and then a newspaper by the same name, which her daughter edited and she funded. And this was really important because a lot of Black women's suffrage work was done through these women's clubs, which had a wider agenda. They were also working on a lot of different social reforms, on education, but also on suffrage. And so the Woman's Era covered a variety of topics, including a lot of different opinions from some of these women on the importance of the right to vote. Black women also supported suffrage through suffrage clubs. One of the most notable is Ida B. Wells here in Chicago, who started the Alpha Suffrage Club. And she was a journalist, so it was kind of an obvious move for her to start a newspaper right away, the Alpha Suffrage Record. And this one was really important as well because Illinois passed women's suffrage in 1913. And so when she started her newspaper, she was using it as a tool for education to provide information to Black women so that they could learn more about the candidates and the different campaigns that were coming up and use their vote to really wield power within the city and within the state. This is Carrie Chapman Cat. We saw her a couple slides ago. She was one of the presidents of the national organization. And in 1914, she inherited a very large sum from Mrs. Frank Leslie, who left her entire estate to her. It was originally valued at nearly $2 million, and Cat came away with about $1,000 once everything was settled. And she understood that the most important thing that she could do with this money was use it for publicity. So she hired a whole floor full of 25 publicists for the organization, and they were sending out all kinds of materials from cartoons to editorials to newspapers around the country, both local kinds of newspapers as well as those that were controlled by other women. And she went back to Alice Blackwell, whose Women's Journal was so deeply in debt for many, many years, and she bought that from her, bought a couple of other smaller newspapers, and created the New Woman Citizen. This was so important to Cat that she spent $75,000 of that inheritance in the first year on the Women's Journal and the New Woman Citizen. And I have to note that the entire budget for the national organization the year previous had been $38,000. So for her to turn around and spend, nearly twice as much on just one newspaper shows how important it was for women to be able to control their own voice. And finally, here's Alice Paul, the more militant suffragist who led the National Women's Party, which was kind of a rival to the NASA, the national organization. And she recognized right away that because the Women's Journal had just been purchased by the national organization, that her rival organization probably wasn't going to get fair coverage. So she started her own newspaper, The Suffragist, and again, also went into debt in order to get this put out. So I think it's really clear just how important it was to suffragists to be able to reach the public through these kinds of newspapers. And I think it's also clear that these channels of communication often did not cross racial lines. So we saw the friendship between Marianne Wilkinson and Charlotte Hawkins Brown. There were certainly friendships that did cross racial lines, but in many cases they did not, and they were separate. And although certainly there were Black and other women of color who wrote articles that were in the newspapers that came out of the national organizations, it's clear they also had to start their own, really, in order to express their own reasons and reasons for wanting the right to vote and ideas about what that meant in a larger sense. So I would say that when they put pen to paper, they really did create communities, but the racism within the movement really forced these communities often to be separate and put boundaries around those communities. And today, I think that challenges us to really ensure that we are intentionally creating much more inclusive communities by the way that we use social media and other tools in order to create community. So to just kind of wrap it up, I would say that suffragists put pen to paper. They wrote thousands, millions really, of letters, and they printed their own newspapers to communicate with each other and with the public so that they could certainly nurture deeper relationships, which we know are so important to having an organization and a movement be strong, to connect their supporters across the miles and across all of these cultural and racial differences, as well as to connect with the wider public. And in connecting with the wider public, it was also clear that it was really important for them to be able to control their message. This was at a time when the New York Times was anti-suffrage, so they couldn't use the mainstream media for support. They couldn't depend on that, and they really had to control the message themselves in order to build the kind of mass movement that demonstrated that women really wanted the right to vote. Today we're using email, we're using Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and I think it's really important to remember as we're posting and retweeting and liking that it's essential the way we use social media to be intentional about building communities as we work to advance gender equity, anti-racism, social justice, and human rights. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing and love to talk some more with some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Joan. I really appreciated the opportunity to visually see some of the history. And, all week long we've been hearing these names. And so it was really fun to watch you bring this history to life for us today. And so thank you for that. Thank you so much. There is so much that I want to follow up on with regards to this presentation that we can dig into. But I want to start actually first allowing us to know and learn a little bit more about you. And so I'm very curious to know more about your background and more importantly, why did you decide, how did you come to decide to devote your career to the history of the women's movement and philanthropy?
So I have been writing about women's history since the early 90s and had really focused on what women were doing and why, and how they were using education as kind of a tool to empower themselves, what kind of rights they were seeking, how they were seeking them through women's clubs and through other sorts of organizations. And when I was in the archives, I usually would kind of skip over the box that was labeled finances because I was more interested in their ideas, in their ideology and what they were seeking. And about 10 years ago, I think probably with all the focus on campaign finance and philanthropy, I kind of had a light bulb moment where I realized I really needed to follow the money to understand how women were able to make change for themselves. How they were able to finance everything that they were doing and to really wield some power in a society at a time when they didn't have a lot of political power. So that's sort of how I fell into it and found a whole lot of very fascinating philanthropists who were funding various parts of the movement.
That's one of the things I love about historians is this intense passion around curiosity and where it can lead you. So you talked a lot in your presentation about the using philanthropy and then to fund kind of this pen to paper, this idea for newspapers, the idea of creating vehicles of communication that were both internal and external in terms of objectives. Was there anything surprising in your research with regards to the way philanthropy played a role beyond kind of just, funding these, which is important, the way the suffragists communicated? Anything, in particularly because women didn't have any official political power?
Yes, so I've been eagerly reading all of the Women's Philanthropy Institute reports and about women's philanthropy and funding for women's causes today. And what's really just so notable is the way in which women are still funding women's causes and have some of the same kind of deep personal reasons of experiencing their own discrimination and really wanting to make a difference and make change for other women. And of course, we had then in the suffrage movement and certainly have now male allies, but clearly the bulk of funding is coming from women, and it really is women who are making change for other women. And so that's evident just in a lot of different areas. In education, for example, and one of the things that I did find surprising was the way in which many of the women that I studied were giving to more than one cause. So they understood that political equality was necessary, so was economic empowerment. And in order to have that economic empowerment, they needed to reach across and work with women in the labor movement. They also needed to open up employment and educational opportunities for women as well. So just one example of that, Mary Jones was a philanthropist from Chicago in the late 1800s and early 1900s. She was one of the first Black families to Chicago in the early 1840s, actually. And when her husband died, she inherited about $50,000 in the late 1870s. And so she gave to a lot of different women's organizations in Chicago, Black organizations in Chicago. And one in particular was to help start Provident Hospital, which was the first hospital in Chicago for Black residents, that also had as part of it, which she was really passionate about, was a training school for nurses, because Black women in particular, there was one who had kind of started to ask for the ability to go to the other nurse training schools in the area and was not allowed to. And so you can see how in her philanthropy, she's providing health care. She's also providing employment and education for Black women and an opportunity for them to work and provide care to the community at that hospital. And so a lot of philanthropists in this time period that I'm studying are funding education, they're funding employment, they're funding political rights, and they see all of these related. And Mary Jones was a supporter of the suffrage movement as well, and apparently had hosted Susan B. Anthony when she was in Chicago. So I think all those ties are really important. The other thing, or another piece of it, is the direct funding for lobbying. So we know just how important it is today, funding for political causes, and certainly then women were giving not only to the suffrage movement, but in particular, another activity that Cat used Leslie's money for was to build another headquarters in Washington, D.C., and to hire another staff, and this was a lobbying staff who were full-time lobbyists in Congress so that they ultimately could get the 19th Amendment passed. So I think that's important as well.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So going to switch gears a little bit to talk about, bring us back to today. And the feminist movement today has faced many challenges related to intersectionality, which you touched on in your presentation. How did these same sorts of questions come up around the 19th Amendment organizing? And what might we learn from it today?
That's a great question. And I think if you've been reading some of the wonderful editorials in the news recently, we've been just studying really the role of women of color in the movement, really for a good 20 to 30 years. And I think now is finally getting some of the publicity and a more general understanding that's really necessary. So I would just make a couple of comments. One is the question of intersectionality specifically. And white women in the movement, as a generalization, really did not understand the lived experience, the lived intersectional experience of Black women. And so they really didn't understand when Black women talked about the right to vote and how important it was for fighting for racial justice as well as against sex discrimination. And that's really becomes evident after the 19th Amendment is ratified and Black women go to register to vote across the South. And while some were able to, many more were not. The registrars denied their ability to vote, just as they had for Black men after the 15th Amendment at the end of the Civil War. And so Black women are going to white women in the national organizations and saying, you know, this is a problem that we would like to put on the agenda and deal with. And Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, specifically said, no, that's a race issue, not a gender issue. And so that was a real problem and a real miss and a real misunderstanding at the time. And it reveals some of the ways in which some white women were really willing to oppress others as they tried to get voting in a limited fashion only for certain women. In terms of lessons for today, I think I'd probably want to go back to Ida B. Wells Many of you have probably read a little bit about the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. That's gotten a lot of publicity lately. And the kind of now becoming famous story of how Alice Paul decided that in order to not offend her Southern white followers, that Black women should march at the back of the parade. And we know that Ida B. Wells refused, and she joined the parade in the middle so that she could walk with the Illinois delegation. But one of the things that to me was really important about that is a letter that she wrote afterwards to one of her white supporters here in Evanston, actually. And she said to her, you know, it's really important. The Illinois delegation had argued over what they should do. There was a lot of dissension within the Illinois delegation, and some of the women said, no, we need to do the right thing. We need to set an example of doing the right thing. And others said, no, we need to follow Alice Paul's dictate and follow the rules and not stand up for Ida B. Wells. And so Ida B. Wells, when she writes to one of her white supporters, says to her, you know, it's only necessary that we stand up for our principles as much as anyone else is standing up for theirs. You know, they're wrong principles. And so I think that's really important to do the right thing and to rise above the times or rise above constraints, rise above expediency, and really to stand up for our principles and to take action. And so to me, that's a challenge that really resonates for me today.
Thank you. Let's circle back to another comment that you made in the presentation with regards to how the suffragists were communicating. And so, as you referenced, many women today are using social media sites like Facebook to organize around the causes that they care about. We like to say here at WPI that, you know, women are very much drawn to a more expanded definition of philanthropy. And so along with the traditional 3 T's, we've also like to add, so it's time, treasure, and talent, but we've also added testimony and ties. And social media has allowed women to really exercise in that testimony and ties space. What do you think that women today, and you saw from our poll how many of us are active, what can we learn from the organizers behind the 19th Amendment, kind of beyond what you talked about in your presentation?
Yeah, so that's such an interesting question. One of the things I think that's important about what they did was they were very good at, I guess, what would be the equivalent today of having something go viral. So they were very good at getting attention and doing things that were considered to be a little bit controversial or unusual for women. And so, for example, when they picketed the White House, that was, of course, extremely controversial, especially during World War I, to be picketing the White House. And suffragists were arrested and put into jail, and some were force-fed there. And so not only did they get publicity by speaking out about what their experiences were, they also created what they called the Prison Special, which was a train tour that took place in the West, in states where women already had the right to vote, and women who had been arrested and imprisoned for being in front of the White House were on this train going around giving speeches. So they had the ability to really have some dramatic moments to publicize those in a wide variety of ways, to really get their message out and to kind of use spectacle, to use the parades, to use the prison special, to use automobiles, to use these ways that made it much more dramatic and could really get people's attention. And then I think the other piece of it, besides the testimony, is also the action. So there was often an action. And I know today we talk a lot about is it enough to just retweet something or like something, right? We want people to take some action at least. And so for women at that time, the action may have been to join a parade, which was a much more, I think, even more dramatic action than for us today to join a march, for women to be in the streets. And I'll talk a little bit more about the parades as we keep going. But they also had petitions that they were asking people to sign and gathering signatures, and that was important. And in one of my favorite cases, the women in Illinois were trying to get a local legislator to pass a bill. And so they had a phone tree. And so imagine this is like the early 1910s. So you still have to call the operator. And one after another, they were calling his house to ask him. So his phone kept ringing. And so that's, a little bit similar to what we're asking people to do today, right? At a minimum, is to take at least a little bit of an action to become more tied to the cause. So those are just a few lessons I think that they had for us today.
So let's circle back to this idea of parades, because in-person gatherings continue to be important in today's social movements, as we clearly saw 4 years ago with the Women's March, and then just this summer with all of the protests around anti-racism and social justice reckoning. So let's talk a little bit more about where and how did the suffragists gather 100 years ago?
Yeah, it's a very important question because when we think about it, most women were not comfortable in the streets. So it wasn't really considered proper, right, for women to be in the streets alone. And so they didn't have a lot of public space that was available for them to gather. Many of the early events that they had for suffrage were called parlor meetings because they were literally meeting at each other's homes in their parlors. And so to take that movement and to build it into a mass movement meant you really had to reach the public. You had to reclaim the streets, if you will. This was a time at which department stores were just coming out and becoming spaces that women could kind of safely and properly be seen in public. Just beginning to have women's clubhouses built as well. And so the headquarters of the suffrage movement, the suffrage organizations were really quite important. There's a history of the movement in New York City, which has this wonderful map. It's like a 20-block grid in Manhattan. And you can see there's a half dozen headquarters for different women's organizations. So to be able to have the space to go there, and the headquarters had all the literature and information that you needed, but they also had a lunchroom. They had other kinds of services so that it was, again, a public space where women could actually come and gather and hold their meetings, but also start to build that kind of community. So that was really important. And beyond that, then it was important to get into the streets and hold those parades, which were such a beautiful spectacle. And of course, if you've participated in the Women's March or in one of the marches this summer against the murders of George Floyd and so many more, and for anti-racism, there is certainly a sense of community that one feels out marching with others who are expressing similar kinds of opinions. So I think that was really important, but they were also really important because they were in fact much more diverse than we sometimes realize. When, people in the past had really much more just focused on Susan B. Anthony or Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and we didn't get the full range of voices and participants in the movement. But for example, when we actually look at, well, who was marching? In fact, there were often parts of the parade where women organized by their profession. So you would have the garment workers working together, you'd have the lawyers, you'd have the journalists, you'd have the doctors all marching together. They marched by state, they marched by their college. So to show women were just beginning to be allowed into colleges to get college educations. So to march with the banners of their schools was really important. And also, in addition to Ida B. Wells marching in the parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913, the Delta Sigma Theta Black sorority, which had really just started, marched in that parade as well, as did Marie Baldwin, who was a Native American living in Washington, D.C., and she had just been to law school, so she marched with the lawyers. When we go up to New York City and look at the 1912 parade there, we see Mabel Lee. Mabel Lee was a Chinese immigrant, a young woman. She was, I think, 16 at the time. She goes to Barnard, now associated with Columbia University, and she marched in the parade, and she was actually featured in the New York newspapers because it was so interesting to them that a Chinese immigrant was. And again, when we go to 1920 and we see who can actually have the right to vote, as a Chinese first-generation immigrant, Asian immigrants were not allowed to naturalize to citizenship, only their children were. And so even once the amendment was passed, despite her participation as a suffragist, she was not allowed to become a citizen or therefore to vote. If we go to the West Coast, in Los Angeles Plaza, there's Maria Lopez speaking in Spanish to supporters. So I think that's the other thing about these parades and these kind of public rallies, is that we do, when we actually look at who was there, we see a much more diverse movement. And it was really once the movement became so large and so diverse and went up and had these large donors and philanthropists, very, very wealthy women, all the way to the garment workers and some very poor working class women supporting the movement as well, that we get enough of a momentum and the tide turning for the movement. And so the parades were also really important in terms of showing that this was a mass movement. And when Susan B. Anthony and some of the other early supporters had wanted, the right to vote, they were told specifically, well, we don't see any evidence that all women want it. It seems it's just, your little fringe group. And so it was really important to be in the streets and to show, no, this is a mass movement that women really want the right to vote.
It's such an inspiring story and so important for especially those young people who have taken to the streets this summer to kind of hear and learn from. So I want to kind of switch because I want to give time for our audience members to ask their questions. We have quite a few really great questions, Joan. So, let's jump in to the audience questions. So here's the first one. And it has to do with the philanthropy part of the women's movement. So how involved were women of less impressive means in the movement? So you mentioned the garment workers. Did the wealthier women have a connection to women of lower means? And did the suffragist message resonate with the average woman?
That's a great question. Yes, the movement did cross across class lines. And I think what I found is right in this time period, there were many, many, many women who were giving small amounts of money to the movement, as well as large amounts of money. And so the National Women's Party has actually a 200-page plus typewritten list of every single donor from 1913 until the amendment passed in 1920. And it lists 50-cent donations, $1 donations, all the way up to the $76,000 that Alva Belmont gave to that organization. So absolutely, the activism and activity of all kinds of women, as well as the funding that came from all sorts of women, was really important. But I will say that there just wasn't enough money coming from that grassroots effort, and it was really some of these very large donations like Leslie's $1 million gift that could really make a dramatic change and push the organizations to be able to do some of the tactics and strategies that they had really had to do in much smaller pieces earlier. So it's kind of a combination, but I will say that some of these very large donations did have a really significant effect. there were some of these suffragists, the large donors, who really did see themselves as women, despite their class, despite their race, despite their privilege, sharing something. They had a kind of imagined sisterhood. If these other women. And so they all had something in common with women working in garment factories because they were all suffering from abusive men. Her husband was cheating on her. So that's how she was suffering from an abusive man, again, despite her privilege. And so she tried to really build this sense of sisterhood and to say, you know, we all need to work on this together. But ultimately, I would judge her to say that her intent was better than her impact. And in the end, she did have a little bit of that kind of savior and I'm going to do this for you instead of with you. And sort of, you know, not recognizing the agency, the history of working class women already working for the right to vote before she came along. So that does cause this kind of clash between her and working class women. And the same thing happens when she reaches out to Black women in Manhattan as well. Irene Moorman was the Black suffragist who worked with her, and they did build a headquarters together. But again, it was a similar situation in which Belmont sort of thinks she's bringing the movement to them when they've been suffragists and had an organization in Brooklyn since the 1880s. So that kind of recognition in the women's movement and women's organizations, we're still trying to, you know, we're still learning that lesson and trying to do better around that.
You mentioned that as men as allies, one of the questions we have is, was there a difference in approach or tone when women were asking other women versus asking men, and how and what role did men play in this movement?
So there were some male supporters. Most notably, there was a group of men that organized in New York City. I think it was in 1917. It was for the second referendum. And there were some very wealthy men who actually also gave quite a bit of money. But if you look at who they are, they're the fathers, they're the sons, they're the brothers of women who were active, who were suffragists themselves. So for me, the takeaway is that women, those who identify as women or those who identify for equity across gender identity need to really take the lead. And by our activism and our support for the movement, we sort of bring men or bring other allies into it.
Yes.
And that's the way I sort of see the necessity of building that momentum. That's what worked for the suffragists at the time.
Seems pretty similar in today's world too as well. So kind of thinking about this intersectionality where Black women were very involved, as you said earlier, in suffragists and equal rights. The working as one community of women, do you have any sense of how these women dealt with the different outcomes for white women and Black women? Kind of what happened after 1920 and when it wasn't, you know, for everybody?
So that's a great question. As I said, Black women did go to the National Women's Party. They went to the League of Women Voters, and they went to the commission, the women's part of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation in the South, or the Committee for Interracial Cooperation in the South. And they really did try to get white women to understand that they were being denied the right to vote and that this was something that they should all be working on together. And for the most part, they were unsuccessful at getting women to really want to fight that, white women to really want to fight that battle for them. The first place that we see more of a coming together is really a little bit later in the 30s and into the 40s, when there are white women from the South in particular who do begin to work with Black women, both against lynching in the Southern Association of Women for the Prevention of Lynching, and also against the poll tax, because the poll tax really disfranchised a lot of white women as well as Black men and women in the South. And then, of course, that effort just, has to keep going up until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then, of course, continues today as we're fighting all the various forms of voter suppression that are taking place today. So that's sort of a very long trajectory. We talked about progress as kind of a spiral, right? And so when we see these advances, we also see that they're not complete and there's a lot more work to be done. For other groups of women, there were sometimes similar sorts of results. I mentioned Asian American or Asian immigrant women whose children were citizens and could vote, but who could not until really the 1940s with World War II, when the United States changed that legislation to allow for naturalization for Asian immigrants. Native Americans, there's a new book coming out that talks quite a bit about Native Americans and suffrage. It's, I think, going to be very fascinating. And one of the things that's going on there is that in the 1920s, there is legislation that is passed around Native citizenship. So I do think that across a lot of different groups, there are sort of larger efforts that when women are specifically talking about women's suffrage, they're also talking more broadly about what does it mean to be a citizen? What are our rights as citizens to vote? What are our duties as citizens to vote, as well as other kinds of duties and rights of citizenship? And so that larger discussion is taking place then continuously for many of these different groups.
So one of the questions, and this might be our last one as we look at the time, kind of keeping us kind of in this current time. Do you have any suggestions about how philanthropic organizations can find women who may have interest in funding change in an organization that they may not be familiar with? What are 1 to 3 practical things we can do today to make a difference?
You saved the hardest question for
lessons from history.
Yeah, I think, some of the lessons are what not to do as opposed to what to do. But I think clearly there is a need to be very articulate about what our goals are and to be expansive about those goals. And then to really be very, very proactive about reaching out across the community and listening. Listening and learning to what the needs are of others and what would bring these groups together, what would allow a group to grow in their outreach. I think that women who are working for gender equity in so many ways today, there are many efforts that really do highlight some of the more democratic and power to grantees within women's funds, for example, and really do try to bring all participants to the table and to listen and to give voice and actual power to many. And I think that kind of work is a start and needs to continue. And then I just think the outreach needs to be on social media as widespread as possible, but then also personal as widespread as possible. And that really does takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of listening. So I don't really have a magic bullet, unfortunately.
as you've clearly shown in this truly enlightening and inspiring conversation and presentation today, Joan, that progress is indeed a spiral. And so I would have never expected you to have a magic bullet, because this work is hard and it is complex and it is very human. And what I love about our time today was a reminder of the power women have in this space and that we continue to have. I have learned so much in just our 1 hour together today, and I'm excited about the idea that we can continue to go viral 100 years ago to today. I love the idea that we continue to have what is our the parlor meeting in 2020 through this Zoom meeting together today. And then the other thing that I'm going to take away from a presentation is the term sauceback. So very excited to add that new term to my vocabulary. But I do want to thank all of you again for joining us in commemorating this very historic moment. And then I hope that what Joan is leaving with us all today is to be inspired to continue to do the work. And there are many things that still need to be done. And we can all do it together. So this will be recorded. So for those of you, there were some messages in the chat saying that they had to kind of leave, but happy to return and post where we'll have this recording. And we look forward to seeing all of you again in the future. And again, many thanks to Joan for your longstanding friendship and partnership with WPI. It is very much a symbiotic relationship. You use our research, but we rely on you to confirm things that we are seeing on the ground and still today. So thank you so much, Joan. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.